Hey guys, hey, this is Matthew. Um, this is sort of the beginning to the digital media class and me trying to familiarize all of you with the interface that you're going to be using for the next 16 weeks and beyond with me. Um, just to kind of get started, Illustrator is one of my favorite programs. Yeah, in my opinion, it's one of the more powerful Adobe programs. I really don't use Photoshop very much unless I'm actually editing photos. But Illustrator itself has a lot of creative power. In other words, creating things from scratch, manipulating objects, um, working with color very powerfully, diagramming, and you can even see some of the past projects that I've been working on. In fact, this was something I was working on to fabricate with a laser cutter in a lab. I was going to outline a Yeti, which I brought into Adobe Illustrator, and I traced it, turned it into a digital graphic, and then inversed it so I would only have a simple line kind of surrounding the Yeti profile. And then I just added a heart in the middle that I wanted to engrave. This here is me diagrammatically sort of mapping a photograph. I'm starting to do the same thing here. This is just a fun profile pic that I was making, just kind of messing around. Um, this is a painting that I'm working on, or actually completed, regarding George Floyd. So you can see, like, there are lots and lots of things happening here. I'm creating logos. I'm working on digital art. I'm mapping out plans for analog paintings. I'm using it for website layout sketches. It's very, very flexible and powerful. And my goal today is to kind of give you a walkthrough that you might even have to watch 2 or 3 times to make sure that you're familiar with everything. But yeah, just kind of, I always jokingly say this in the classroom, it's been the pandemic and we've been teaching online. It's been working okay. But I love saying this in the classroom, that if I had to walk down the aisle with one software application in my life, it would probably be Adobe Illustrator. So I really do love this program. It's lots and lots of fun and very, very useful. So you need to get Adobe Illustrator on your personal machine if you haven't got it already. And I assume that if you're watching this video, then you're kind of ready to go. But when you do fire up that software on either a PC or Mac, you're going to see more or less the same thing. But if you're working on a PC, you should understand, first of all, that I'm working on a Mac and things might be slightly different. The keys and the special keys and the power keys, or whatever those things are called, and things might be laid out very, very slightly differently. But I think, I'm pretty sure that it's not going to be an issue. So anyway, you fire up Illustrator and you see this introductory box, and you're going to see some past projects that you might have been working on. You're going to see some possible templates for sample projects, or actually presets, I guess is the language that they're using here. But you can always just hit create new, right? And this additional dialog box is going to pop up. And again, here are all these presets that you're going to see according to the type of project that you're doing. I have to be honest, usually I go to print, and more often than not, I'm using a custom aspect ratio size for my artboard. And the artboard is where all the artwork or the digital graphics are going to be placed. But anyway, it's important to be aware of all these presets that you can use dependent on your project. But my honest advice is to go to print, especially if you're new to this. And for this particular project, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be, again, familiarizing yourself with the workspace and some of these tools so that you can kind of basically dip your toes into this process of using Illustrator, which can be a little bit tedious, but once you sort of break down that wall, it's very, very easy, okay? But in order to break down that wall, you just have to kind of get in the water, okay? So don't be timid about this process. Just the first project is meant for you to experiment and play without any notion of right or wrong, so that you can just get in there and mess around with the tools. Up here, what I usually like to do is I like to give a project a title, and I'm just going to call this project -1. And by the way, I always kind of use lowercase letters when I'm giving a title to a project. And I also separate things with a dash so that when I'm searching for things later, it can possibly come up. And you should probably give things an intuitive name like project 1 digital media. Maybe that's a good start. And you can change your increments here between pixels, points, picas, inches, feet, etc., etc. I think that everyone is going to be relatively familiar with inches, so that's not a bad place to start. And once you change that, you can see that these increments kind of change here under width and height. And you can see specifically that it's 8.5 inches by 11 inches. And it's going to be portrait right now. But actually, my suggestion for this project would be to work landscape. So do you see how these kind of like inverted right there? You can decide how many artboards you want. Typically, you can add those later. So just leave that as 1 right now. You don't need any kind of bleed. And the bleed is basically, if you're doing a publication document, sometimes you want a little bit of a bleed to sort of go outside of the border of the actual paper to make sure that the ink fully covers the paper. So you don't have any weird, awkward, I guess, inkless spots. I would advise you to stay in CMYK color mode. CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and K or key, which is essentially black. So cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. The other option, of course, is RGB, which is red, green, blue. RGB is meant for a computer screen, but if eventually you're working on a publication document, you're going to want to use CMYK because that's the system that is being used by, for example, an Epson printer. So stay with CMYK because this is, it's going to work out better for you. So just trust me on that one. Clicking on more settings to see what else we have here. 300 PPI or DPI. PPI stands for pixels per square inch. And sometimes you'll see this expressed as DPI, so dots per square inch. But typically 300 or higher is print quality, which is industry standard. So that's sort of a good thing to know as well. Everything looks pretty good to me. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit create down here on the lower right. And now we have our beginning. So I'm going to delete all of these other boxes. They're kind of getting in the way of us viewing things. And by the way, if you just saw what I did, it's something I do all the time. And I know you can't see my keyboard, but essentially I'm hitting Command minus and plus so that I can zoom in to my artboard. And then if I just want everything to fit on my screen, all I have to do is hit Command 0 and it'll go back to square one so I can see everything really clearly. So I'm going to walk you through some of these tools. I'm not going to show you all of them, but I am going to show you the ones that I think are pretty useful at this point in time. So the first thing you want to do, I guess, in Illustrator is you want to know how to create a graphic. And some of these guys have little arrows kind of next to them. And so if you take your pointer and you hold your cursor over that object, pressing down, then you're going to get some additional options. I'm just going to start with the rectangle for now. And so I'm going to just drag with my mouse to create an object, a rectangle object. And you can see if I select, I can use the black arrow tool here to select that object. And if I click away, I'm deselecting, okay? If I select that object again, notice how there's a fill and a stroke color associated with that object, which is very important. You can also adjust some other options here. So for example, you could take that opacity back to 25% and see how it kind of lightened up there. So by the way, Illustrator is object-based. So in order to make a change to an object, you have to select it, then come up here and change it back to 100, okay? So now it's 100% again. I can basically change this object midway. I can give it a different fill, so I can make it red. I can select it again, and then I can change the stroke, and I can make the stroke magenta. In fact, let's just so you can see the stroke a little bit more clearly, I'm going to make the fill yellow. So I don't know if you guys can see that. I'm going to zoom in like I had shown you earlier. I can change the size of that stroke to like 1 inch, which is absurdly too large, obviously. So that gives you an idea about the fill and the stroke and the way that you can modify an object when it's selected. I can select that object again, and I can grab these little handles associated with that object, and I can drag things around and change. The other thing that I think is useful that I want to show you guys right off the bat is the grid. So right now, smart guides are on, and we're not seeing them right. Well, I guess you are seeing, see that little line right in the middle there? That's a smart guide. So it's basically saying that I'm in line with where the object was. But essentially, when you're moving these multiple objects around an artboard down the road, you're going to see these smart guides maybe kind of giving you clues and talking to you a little bit. And those are smart guides. They're pretty useful. I also like to snap objects to the grid because I just love the grid, period. It rationalizes and orders things. It's not appropriate for every project, but it's certainly worth showing you. So I think I can show you guys here, view, there's guides. Of course, you can show rulers here. That's pretty handy. Show grid right there. So I can zoom in and I can see all these larger 1 inch increments that are sort of highlighted. And then these little, I guess, 1/32 or 1/16 increments. So if I come up here and I say I want to snap to grid, and I grab this rectangle tool, see how it's kind of talking to the grid? I can create perfect objects. Additionally, if I use my left pinky and I hold down Shift, I can create a perfect square, okay? And again, I can go back. I can actually remove the stroke altogether by clicking on this white cube with the red line through it. So it's nothing but fill. And I can always bring that stroke back later if I want. I can also invert those guys. So see how now it's a yellow stroke, and I can bring it back so it's a yellow fill. Sometimes that can be pretty handy. I can go back and, of course, always modify these guys. And I can also grab from the corner and move things around. So I've been using the black arrow tool quite a bit because it's just very, very useful. You're constantly using it. And it's essentially, in my mind, I call it the black arrow tool, and it's the selection tool. I guess that's the technical term for it. But in my mind, you can select things at a more superficial level. That's the best way of putting it. Select things at a superficial level with the black arrow tool, and then you can modify them slightly, the dimensions, for example, like what we've been doing. Now the white arrow tool, watch what happens. So I've got the black arrow tool and I've selected the object. If I just move over to the white arrow tool, something changes. And essentially these anchors pop up that are associated with this vector object. And by the way, a vector is just digital information. If you're using Photoshop, you're using pixels, or you're focused on a pixel workspace. But in Adobe Illustrator, everything is mathematic. All of these beautiful shapes and forms that you're going to be making are being created by some sort of software mathematical formula and ones and zeros to create a very, very focused. I mean, you can zoom into this and everything is crystal clear. That's the beauty of vector graphics. If you zoom into a raster Photoshop image, it degrades very, very quickly, which can be either good or bad dependent on your project and process. So we were talking about anchors, and we can delete anchors, we can add anchors, we can, if I double click on one of these guys and see, I have snapped a grid on it. See how that anchor point is moving around on the grid? It's beautiful. I love that. We can just kind of, change the object manually that way. The other thing that we can do, and I'm going to introduce the pen tool now, okay? Before I do that, I want to show you another trick with the white arrow tool. When you do, so let's back up for a second. I'm going to select this object with the black selection, black arrow tool. And now I'm going to select that same object. I'm going to sort of switch over to the white arrow tool. And these anchors are visible, but also these little guys kind of show up. And you can grab these and you can pull them in to sort of round your points, which is pretty nifty as well. So now look what happens. If I go back and select with the white arrow tool, these additional anchors were created so that we could create this sort of contour form around this object. We can go ahead and we can, modify this again as well. So now you're familiar with the black arrow tool and the white arrow tool and the power of those guys. The next thing I want to do is I want to show you the pen tool. So the pen tool is another very, very powerful object within Adobe Illustrator. And I'm going to turn off snap to grid momentarily. So now, and then I'm going to make it go away too, so that we don't see the grid and we're not distracted by it anymore. But essentially with the pen tool, you can intuitively just create, and it's so amazing. Look what I'm doing there. It'll kind of like, I love the pen tool. So the trick is, when you are using the pen tool, I just zoomed in on that guy on my keyboard. The trick is you always want to close your object. You don't want to end over here. You actually want to end where you started. And as soon as I take my pen tool and I put it close to the anchor point where it started, it's actually gonna want to gravitate and snap to that anchor point. And then you're gonna see that little orange circle icon appear. And then you just close that guy up, okay? So now we've got this object, and of course, just like any other object, we can go back and we can grab those anchor points and we can manipulate them after the fact with the white arrow tool. We can also soften up some of those corners like I had shown you earlier. We can change the fill color. We can, again, add a stroke, which is pretty nifty. We can go back and we can snap to grid again. And if we select that object and then move to the white arrow tool, we can move those anchor points in accordance with the backdrop grid that we're currently snapping to right here. I'm going to turn that off, but I think I showed that to you guys twice because I think it's really important. The other thing about the pen tool is that you can add anchor points. So if I come over here, and see how it's kind of that, I'm going to zoom in so I can show you guys a little bit more closely. But if you have the pen tool enabled and you hold it down, you're going to see these additional options to add an anchor or to delete an anchor. What we want to do is we want to add an anchor right now. Okay, so look at this. Boom, boom. Then I can use that white selection tool and I can move things around. Alternatively, if I click on the pen tool, and then I go to the delete anchor point, I can actually select an anchor point and just get rid of it. Oh, and this is interesting right now too. Look what has appeared. We have these anchors, but additionally, we have these unique handles. So these guys will pop up and you can basically manipulate them to modify the amount of curvature that you have associated with your vector. And that's really what this is. This is your vector. This is where all of your information is being mapped out, that beautiful line right there. And that's your stroke, and then everything on the inside is your fill. So I think we have a good understanding of the pen tool. What if you want to make some text? Okay, let's make some text. So all you do is select the T or type tool, drag. As soon as you drag, it's going to automatically populate with lorem ipsum. And lorem ipsum is essentially just placeholder text. It's gibberish. It doesn't really mean anything, but it's oftentimes useful if you are if you're working on a publication document and you haven't received the copy from your from whoever's writing that copy, but you still want to know how the text is going to look within your document. Well, you can use lorem ipsum in the meantime until those other guys catch up with you because you're so fast with your design work. You can change the size of the text up here. You can change the font. And of course, my go-to all the time is Helvetica or Baskerville. I think they're very effective, beautiful fonts. This has become an object, right? And you can move it around just like you can move around any of these objects, which is pretty cool. If you open up this text box, it's not going to change the size of the text, but it's going to allow you to add additional text so it's not hidden. And the reason why that's useful is because you want to control the boundaries of your text and where things are going. So for example, if you're creating a trifold brochure for a food truck or something like that, you want text only in certain areas of that document. You want to be able to control how that text is interacting with the paper. And that's why, and again, look, I'm using the black arrow tool and grabbing these boundaries and moving them around, okay? And by the way, see those are those smart guides I was telling you about. They're talking to you right now. The smart guides are telling me that the bottom of that text box is in direct alignment with the far north point of that orange object. So that's an example of how smart guides or what are they called again? I always forget that. Yeah, smart guides, how they operate within the workspace. You can always, if you want to modify the text within a text document, you actually have to kind of dive in. So with the black arrow tool, you double click in and you can change this to NOT or now, blah, 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 just anything. You can change it. But look what happens if I keep adding lots and lots of gibberish. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to change this text to 8. If you look, not all the text is fitting within that text box, and Illustrator is notifying me of that by showing me that little red X. And what you can do is you can click that and then see I've grabbed the remainder text and I can link it to another text box. So that's really useful if, for example, let's use the trifold brochure example again. If the text is going to feed to the bottom of that particular margin, and then you need it to feed to the next page, you can use this technique to sort of link those two text boxes so that things are going to be a little bit more free-flowing. So that's using text within Adobe Illustrator. You can also reflect text as well at some point with one of these tools. This is rotate, and reflect is right below that. So those are two handy things that we'll talk about here in a second. The other thing I want to talk about right now, though, is we have, if you hold down the rectangle tool, we can create these ellipses or rounded rectangles, rather. Here's the ellipse tool. So if I drag again, and if I hold shift, I can make a perfect circle. The other thing that I want to show you, like let's say you need a circle to be an exact width and height. So maybe it needs to be 1 inches. Maybe sometimes it's a good idea to turn that snapped grid on and look at that. That circle is precisely 1 inches high and 1 inches wide. So that's how I accomplished that. And remember, I hold shift with my left pinky while I'm creating the ellipse. You can create polygons, which is kind of cool. And then while you're holding and dragging, you can use the arrow tools to reduce or increase the amount of points. That can be very useful. And again, because this is an object, those same rules apply where I can change the fill, I can give it a stroke, blah, blah, blah. So you can see that this program is very, very powerful as far as creating graphics. Another thing I'd like to show you today is the brush tool, which is pretty self-explanatory. And of course, by the way, when you select on these different tools on the left-hand side, you're going to sometimes see options change up here at the top. So for example, you have these different brush methods that you can sort of apply. You can say that you want the brush to be larger. You can just make all these changes. Whoop, that obviously is way too big. But anyway, pay attention to these options because they're kind of fun when you're working on your project. And by the way, let's talk about your project for a second. Again, this project, it's 8.5 by 11 landscape, which is exactly what we're working on. And what I want you to do is essentially just create an abstract piece of art. I want you to Do a little bit of sketching possibly first. It could be realistic, it could be abstract, it could be anything you want. Really, all I want you to do is just get in there and have fun with Illustrator and become a little bit more comfortable with the application using all of these tools. And the other thing I forgot to mention, and I'll do this all the time, but if you hover over these guys, see the little letter that's sort of associated with the definition of that tool. So that's the selection tool. Well, if you hit V, then that black arrow tool will come up. So at any time, if I just hit V, the black arrow. So those are the shortcut hotkeys that can be really advantageous if you're, here's the truth, if you're a graphic designer and you're sitting at your desk for 8-10 hours a day doing this kind of work, shortcuts become handy very, very quickly. And I'll just leave that statement right there. I'm sure you guys all understand. If you want to create a simple line instead of an object, well, you can do that as well. You can just use the line tool. Obviously, that's a very large line that I'm going to modify into a smaller, I guess, more conservative line. I'm going to select that. I'm going to change that color to this kind of cyan blue. If you hold down the brush tool, you're going to get the blob brush tool. And I think, if I remember correctly, you can kind of create these objects. And see what I'm doing there? I can kind of paint. Basically, instead of creating a bunch of vector stroke lines, the blob tool creates more of a fill. So you can go in and kind of fill these guys. So that's pretty handy too sometimes. If you want to reflect an object, let's rotate actually. So you can change the point that it rotates at. So here you can rotate. You can also do that. I actually prefer to do these rotate and reflect commands up here. So I'm going to show you that. Object, transform, reflect, and let's say you just want it to be, I don't know, 90 or 45 degrees. Okay, there we go. So that's the rotate. So anyway, yeah, object, transform, rotate, or reflect, very, very handy. Sometimes scale can be handy. Move, I don't really do much with that because I can just use the black arrow tool to move things around, right? But it really depends on the project that you're working on. A lot of these other tools get very, very complicated, but one thing that I do want to show you that can be handy is the eyedropper tool. So let's say that I have created an object over here, and I'm going to remove all of the information. So look at that. It has the object is still there. It's sort of hiding because it has no fill and has no stroke, but there is still a vector line there. If you drag and select with the black arrow tool, you'll be able to see it. So let's drag and select, and then let's hit I for eyedropper and see how the icon changes. And I'm going to select this guy, and it directly inherited the fill and stroke that was associated with that rectangle. The other thing that this is handy for, let's say, for example, you're working on a logo and there's a very, very specific color that the client wants to use, a very, very specific blue. You can import and place a pre-existing raster file or any type of image file, essentially, into Adobe Illustrator, and maybe you put it on the outside of the artboard, like floating over here. But then you can use that eyedropper tool to select that specific blue so that you can essentially kind of import it into your system, if that makes sense. I think that's plenty to work with for today. I do want to introduce one other thing. We're talking about a lot of stuff on the left-hand side, but in my opinion, it's never too early to start talking about layers. And the book actually talks about layers a little bit later, but I'm just going to briefly introduce them because right now everything is on one layer. I call it layer management, and it's really the key to being successful in Adobe Illustrator. So for example, sometimes you want certain types of elements on a specific layer. So for example, maybe you want typographic text elements on one layer, and that would be at the top. And you can double click. Whoops, if I can spell. Typography. And then I'm going to call this one just content. And so you can move these layers around. I can move an object to another layer. See how I'm dragging that? With it selected, I dragged it and I selected this little highlighted icon to a different layer. So now look, only that one object is on the typographic layer or typography layer. So that's an example of using these layers. You add another layer with this little nifty plus icon down here. And if you get really frustrated with a layer and you want to get rid of it, you can delete it. And usually if you have content on that layer, Illustrator will warn you and basically say, hey, there's content on this layer. What are you doing? You're going to delete all of your hard work. You can also duplicate layers, which is very handy as well, because sometimes you want to do work, but you want to sort of have a backup copy of something. So you can actually just drag that layer down into the plus icon and create a second version of it up here, and then you can make that go away. You can lock layers so that you don't accidentally go into that layer and move things around and mess up your file. There are a lot of advantages to quote unquote layer management. And so I would definitely like to see you guys at the beginning of really exploring that, because that's a good habit for you to form right now. Let's see, the other thing I honestly did, I think, want to show you are gradients. So if I select an object and look at, see, I can't select that object right now. Guess why? Because I have locked it down. I got to unlock it. I'm going to select it. And I believe if I hit G, yes. So that's the gradient tool. So, but what I'm going to do is oftentimes there are sort of windows or palette info boxes where you can get a little bit more nitty gritty with things. And so I can come over here and I can find the gradient box. There it is right there. And I can even drag it out here temporarily so I can work with it. But look at this. I can create a gradient within an object that I was working on. And I can also change the color. It's not doing it right now, but I think you guys get the gist of it. So you can add gradients to an object as well. I'm not a huge fan of gradients, but I did want to just sort of show, I think gradients are a little bit kitschy, sort of like drop shadows. If you do want to use them, I won't hold it against you because you guys are designers and you're in the front seat of things. But occasionally I will kind of put my opinion in there regarding design techniques and tactics. And gradients are a little bit too, what year? I'm not even sure. They're a little bit maybe too like 19, and I love 1989. It's nothing against 1989, but it's just a little passe. So I really like clean, functional graphics. In this circumstance, though, you guys are doing an experimentation and you're just playing. So just don't hold anything back and have fun. Hopefully you'll have some sketches to kind of like photograph or scan for me as well for Blackboard. And speaking of, at some point, you're going to have to export your documents. You got to make sure everything is visible, right? Okay. And then you come up here to File, Export, Export As. And then you're going to make sure to click on Use Artboards, because otherwise, see that little blue that's hanging off? You want it to be cropped, okay? So if any graphics are hanging off the side of the artboard and you click Use Artboards, that means it's going to crop and be exactly 8.5 by 11. And in this circumstance, that's good. So now look at, we've selected PNG, we said Use Artboards. This is the file name up here. We've also selected a location, which is the desktop currently. All we have to do is hit Export. Then this dialog pops up. By default, 300 PPI or DPI, which is print quality, which is good. And this is actually showing you something that's really, really beautiful about Adobe Illustrator as well. Your background doesn't have to be white. It can be alpha channel or transparent. So in other words, you can start stacking images on top of each other so that they're sort of, there's some transparent limited opacity to those documents with the way that they're kind of interacting with each other. That can be very, very valuable within design. Then you hit OK. And let's see if I can track down this file on my crazy desktop. Let's see, it's called Project One. It's always a good idea to, whoops. There it is. So because we exported the file with an alpha channel or with a transparent background, right now on the screen, this is looking kind of grayish. But if we were to print this, the information is null. And so it would be the color of the paper, which is white. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're reviewing your file. You can also zoom in and observe the quality of these PNGs, and it's pretty darn good, okay? I think that's plenty for today, but remember, you need to create an 8.5 by 11 landscape experimental painting where you're basically using all of the tools that I've shown you, including the layers, and you're sort of moving things around, and you're using your aesthetic judgment to create a quote unquote digital painting. And then you're going to export it and upload it to Blackboard. I would also encourage you to use sketches in your sketchbook to kind of get ideas flowing, because that's a really good habit for all artists and designers to get into, is to essentially always have a pencil in your hand and be thinking with that pencil so that you can execute things in software or on Canvas or wherever that idea is going. Thanks everyone for listening. Bye.